Milo Sandoval gripped the arms of his wheelchair so hard, his knuckles went white before he'd said a single word. 10 years old, 8 months removed from the surgery that had finally stopped the worst of the pain in his spine, he leaned toward the nearest biker at the Rolling Freedom sidecar event and whispered 3 words that ended the laughter across that entire parking lot. "He's after me." Roman Cruz followed the boy's line of sight to a gray sedan idling at the far end of the lot. A man behind the wheel who didn't look away once he realized he'd been spotted. 200 people stood in that lot that morning, and not one of them beyond Milo had noticed the car at all. What Roman Cruz did in the next 90 seconds would end with 50 motorcycles forming a wall no car could get through. The Steel Wheels Motorcycle Club held its Rolling Freedom event on the second Saturday of every month in the gravel overflow lot behind Millbrook Community Park, in a stretch of Indiana flat enough that you could see weather coming from 20 miles off. The club had built 4 sidecars over the years specifically for the program, each one fitted with a lift and a harness system a retired physical therapist in the chapter had helped design, so that kids who spent most of their lives being carried or wheeled somewhere could, for one Saturday a month, ride instead of be transported. The smell of hot asphalt and sunscreen hung over the lot most Saturdays, along with the particular sound of 30 conversations happening at once. Parents catching up on folding chairs while their kids waited in line for a turn. A hand-painted sign zip tied to the fence read "Rolling Freedom, Est, 15 years ago," by a guy who needed something to fix. A joke Roman had made once about himself that the club had liked enough to make permanent. Roman Cruz had run Rolling Freedom for 9 years, ever since a slow year in his own life, when he'd needed something to build that felt like it mattered more than the club's usual business. A stretch of months where he'd found himself short-tempered and restless in a way that worried the people closest to him, until his hands finally found something worth fixing again. At 47, built lean rather than broad, he still fitted every harness himself before a single kid got lifted into a sidecar, checking buckles twice out of a habit that went back further than the program itself. A small ritual he performed the same way every single time, regardless of how many parents were waiting behind him in line. His younger brother Mateo had been killed by a hit-and-run driver on a bicycle 30 years earlier. A case that had never been solved, the file still technically open in a records room nobody had touched in over 2 decades. Roman had spent every year since carrying a version of the same question that never fully went quiet. What happens to a family when the person responsible simply drives away and disappears into an ordinary life, buys groceries, mows a lawn, goes to work Monday morning like nothing happened at all? He had never told most of the parents at Rolling Freedom why the program mattered to him the way it did. He didn't need to. It showed in how carefully he checked every buckle, and in how he was always the first one crouched at a kid's eye level rather than standing over them. Before we get to what was parked at the end of that lot, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to Milo Sandoval's turn in line, in a parking lot full of parents and volunteers who had no idea yet that the morning was about to stop being ordinary. Because the next 90 seconds were about to test everything Rolling Freedom had built over 9 years. Milo Sandoval had been an ordinary 10-year-old 8 months ago. The kind of kid who rode his bike to the corner store for candy and back most summer evenings without his mother thinking twice about it. That changed on a June evening when a gray sedan ran a stop sign 3 blocks from his house, struck him hard enough to throw the bike 20 feet, and drove off without stopping, leaving Milo alone on the pavement with a spinal injury that would keep him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The surgery that followed had taken 9 hours and 3 attempts to get right, and Milo had spent the better part of that summer relearning things his body used to do without thinking. how to transfer himself from bed to chair, how to manage stairs that used to mean nothing to him. He had seen the driver's face in the half-second before impact, clear enough to pick out of a photo lineup 3 weeks later, once the police finally identified a suspect from a paint transfer, and a partial plate a neighbor's doorbell camera had caught. His mother, Renata Sandoval, worked 2 jobs to keep the medical bills from swallowing them whole: days at a dental office and evenings waiting tables at a diner off the highway, and had rearranged her entire life around physical therapy schedules and a home that needed a ramp built before Milo could even get back through his own front door. She had not taken a full day off since June and had learned to sleep in the recliner beside Milo's bed for the first 2 months, unwilling to be more than a room away in case something went wrong in the night. A habit she still hadn't fully broken even now that the doctors had told her it was safe to. Milo kept a sketchbook of motorcycles, vintage ones mostly, models he researched at the library because the shapes felt more honest to him than anything with 4 wheels and a windshield had felt since June. A windshield being the last thing he remembered seeing clearly before the world went sideways. He had a favorite, a 1948 Indian Chief he'd drawn at least 30 times from 30 different angles, each one a little more accurate than the last, and he had confided in his mother once, quietly, that he intended to ride one someday, on a bike built with hand controls, no matter what anyone else assumed a wheelchair meant he couldn't do. Rolling Freedom's monthly Saturday had become the one part of his week where that felt like a plan instead of a wish rather than a fantasy. The one place he went where nobody looked at the chair before they looked at him. The man Milo had identified was Dale Croft, 39, who ran a moderately successful auto shop on the other side of Millbrook and had, until that June evening, never had so much as a parking ticket on his record. He'd built the shop over 15 years from a single bay to a 6-lift operation, was well liked by regular customers, and had spent most of his adult life believing that a comfortable, orderly life was something he'd earned and would always be able to manage his way out of trouble if trouble ever found him. He'd been drinking at a friend's house that June afternoon, had panicked the moment he felt the impact, and had spent the following 3 weeks methodically removing the damage from his car at a body shop 2 counties over, before the police caught up to the paint transfer evidence anyway. A decision that had turned one bad afternoon into a felony charge with real consequences attached. Out on bail while he awaited trial, facing charges that his lawyer had made clear could mean real prison time given Milo's injuries, Dale had grown quietly obsessed with the fact that a 10-year-old's identification was the single piece of evidence most likely to put him away for a decade. His lawyer had warned him explicitly, more than once, to have no contact whatsoever with the Sandoval family. Advice Dale told himself he was following even as he found ways around the letter of it. He told himself, in the particular logic of a man used to solving problems with money and confidence, that if the boy simply got confused enough, or scared enough, about what he'd actually seen, the case might collapse before it ever reached a jury, and that he wasn't really threatening anyone so much as reminding a family how uncertain memory could be. It had started small. A car matching Dale's parked across from Milo's school for 3 mornings running, gone before anyone thought to write down a plate number. An unsigned note in the Sandoval's mailbox. Block letters, telling them kids misremember things and it would be a shame for everyone if a mistake ruined a man's whole life. A supposedly chance encounter at the grocery store, where Dale had lingered near the Sandoval's cart just long enough to be noticed and gone before Renata could say a word to him directly, leaving her standing in the cereal aisle with her hands shaking so badly she'd had to leave her basket behind. Detective Paula Ibarra, who had built the original case against Dale and believed every word of it, told Renata honestly that without a clearer connection to Dale himself, a parked car and an unsigned note weren't enough to justify revoking his bail. though she promised to keep watching for exactly the kind of mistake that would give her something she could actually use. She wasn't dismissing them, she made clear, only explaining the frustrating gap between what she believed and what a judge would act on. Renata had left that meeting in tears in the parking lot, not because Ibarra had been unkind, but because she understood, for the first time, that believing her son and being able to protect him were not automatically the same thing. That Saturday, Dale had followed the Rolling Freedom Events public social media page for 2 weeks, watching the check-ins and photos parents posted, telling himself he was only gathering information, the same way he'd have researched a part number before ordering it for the shop. He drove to Millbrook Community Park an hour before the event started, parking at the far end of the overflow lot where he could watch the check-in table without drawing attention, and sat there through most of the morning working up whatever nerve or logic he thought justified what came next. He'd told himself he only meant to look, to gauge for himself how confident the boy still seemed. But by the time Milo's name was called for his turn in the sidecar line, Dale had already opened his car door and started across the gravel toward the fence line, moving with the deliberate, unhurried walk of a man who still believed, on some level, that he had every right to be exactly where he was. Milo recognized the walk before he recognized the face, the particular rolling gait he'd apparently memorized without realizing it in the half-second before the accident, and something in his chest went cold, long before his eyes fully confirmed who it was. His breath caught. His hands found the wheels of his chair. His whole body went still in the specific way it had gone still on a June evening 8 months before. Milo's hands had gone still on the wheels of his chair the moment he saw him, his whole body going rigid in a way his mother would have recognized instantly from the weeks after the accident. He leaned toward Roman, who was crouched checking a harness buckle 2 feet away, and whispered it before his voice could fail him entirely. "He's after me." Roman didn't ask what he meant. He followed the boy's gaze straight to the man now, 30 feet away, and closing. And something in Roman went very quiet and very still, the same stillness he remembered from standing over his brother's photograph 3 decades earlier. He stood up slowly, deliberately, and walked to meet Dale Croft halfway across the lot rather than let him get 1 step closer to the wheelchair. "You need to leave," Roman said. 4 words. Dale tried a smile that didn't sit right on his face. "It's a public park," he said. "I can be wherever I want." Roman didn't raise his voice. "You're on bail with a no-contact order naming that boy specifically," he said. "You just violated it in front of 200 witnesses and whatever's on that live stream a parent's been running for the last 20 minutes. Dale's smile disappeared entirely. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his eyes had already gone to the phones now pointed in his direction, counting them the way a man counts an exit that's rapidly closing. "I know a boy who used to sleep through the night before June," Roman said. "And I know exactly what car matched the paint transfer on his bicycle. Take 1 more step, and you'll be explaining both of those things to a judge tonight instead of tomorrow." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke above the low murmur of 200 people realizing in real time exactly what they were watching. A few parents had already pulled their own kids in closer without quite deciding to, the way a crowd tightens instinctively around a threat it hasn't fully named yet. Engines. That was the sound that rose across the Millbrook Community Park lot in the next 30 seconds, not from riders arriving, because 50 of them were already there for Rolling Freedom, but from 50 engines starting in near unison as members moved their bikes, without a single word passed between most of them, into a tight semicircle between Dale Croft and Milo's wheelchair. Roman hadn't given the order. He hadn't needed to. A road captain named Denise Marsh had seen Dale's face on a parent's live stream from her position near the sidecar line, and had simply started walking her bike into position. And within a minute, 49 others had done the same. Engines idling, forming a wall of chrome and leather that Dale Croft could not have driven through, even if every instinct in him had told him to try. A member named Otis Freeman, whose own daughter had been going through the sidecar line just moments before, planted himself directly in front of Milo's chair with his arms crossed, close enough that Milo could have reached out and touched his jacket if he'd wanted to. Renata Sandoval reached her son through a gap 2 riders made specifically to let her pass, and knelt in front of his chair with both hands on his face, checking, the way a mother checks, that he was actually still breathing evenly. Milo's hands were shaking, but he wasn't crying, and when his mother asked if he was all right, he said the only thing that seemed to matter to him in that moment. "He didn't touch me," he said. "I saw him first." Renata pressed her forehead to her son's and stayed there a long moment, the two of them surrounded on every side by engines that hadn't stopped idling. By that evening, footage of 50 motorcycles forming a silent wall around a child's wheelchair had already been shared thousands of times, and reporters from 2 local stations showed up at the following month's Rolling Freedom event, hoping for interviews. Roman turned most of them down politely, telling the one reporter he did speak with that the story wasn't really about 50 bikers. It was about a 10-year-old who'd had the presence of mind to say something the second he needed to, and that the club had simply done what anyone standing that close would have done for a kid they'd already spent 9 years building ramps and harnesses for. Detective Ibarra arrived 11 minutes later, having been called by 3 separate parents before Roman even finished dialing himself, and the footage from at least 6 different phones, along with 50 riders willing to give matching statements, gave her considerably more than a parked car and an unsigned note. She told Renata afterward that in 15 years on the force she'd never had a scene arrive this well documented before she'd even gotten out of her car. Dale Croft was arrested on the spot for violating the terms of his bail, and by that evening, a judge revoked it entirely, adding a witness intimidation charge that carried its own significant weight on top of the original case. Milo Sandoval testified 5 weeks later, calmly, clearly, and without once looking away from the jury, describing the half-second before impact in the same steady voice he used to describe his favorite motorcycle. And Dale Croft was convicted on every count, sentenced to 11 years. The jury foreman told a reporter afterward that the detail that stayed with her most wasn't the physical evidence, but the fact that a 10-year-old had managed to describe a car's paint color with more precision than most adult witnesses she'd ever heard testify. Roman Cruz sat in the gallery every day of that trial, front row, arms crossed, making sure Dale saw him there each morning before the jury filed in. The Steel Wheels Motorcycle Club arranged an escort for Milo and his mother to and from the courthouse each morning, a rolling wall of exactly the kind that had formed around him in that parking lot, whether or not anyone believed it was still necessary. 10 or 12 bikes at a time, trading off the duty, so no single member had to miss too many mornings at his own job. Renata told a friend afterward that the sound of those engines pulling into her driveway every morning had become the first thing that made her feel like she could breathe again since June. Milo rides in Roman's sidecar every second Saturday now, and last spring, on his 11th birthday, the club presented him with a hand-drawn set of blueprints for a bike fitted with hand controls, the exact model from his sketchbook that Roman has promised him he'll finish building by the time Milo turns 16 and is legally old enough to ride it himself. Renata keeps a photograph from that birthday on the refrigerator, Milo grinning over the blueprints with 50 names signed in the margins, one for every rider who'd formed the wall that day. The publicity around Milo's case did one more thing nobody at Steel Wheels had expected. A retired detective who'd seen the footage online reached out to Roman directly, having recognized the description of the original hit-and-run pattern from a case file he'd never quite let go of, Mateo's case, still technically open after 30 years. It hasn't reopened anything conclusive yet, but for the first time since he was 19 years old, Roman has a phone number for someone still actively looking, and he has started, cautiously, to let himself hope that his own family might someday get the kind of ending Milo's family already has. Roman still checks every buckle twice before a single kid gets lifted into a sidecar, the same ritual he's kept for 9 years. Though these days Milo sometimes reaches down and checks his own a second time right alongside him, an inside joke between them that neither one has bothered to explain to anyone else. A 10-year-old whispered 3 words no child should ever have to say. 50 bikers made sure he never had to face what came next alone. If you believe every child deserves someone willing to stand between them and whatever's coming, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.